really want to emphasize, as Lisa did, this is very much a conversation, speaking with. I'm not speaking at or to you, as it were. And I'm going to do that for a few minutes because I want to set the stage a little bit more in terms of giving you a sense of where I and more importantly, we at Retraction Watch see certain trends, certain things happening, and just to foster conversation. And please, as was just mentioned, challenge, grill me, all of those things. I really look forward always to great conversations and to learning from all of you. I see some familiar names and faces among you, and so I look forward to those conversations as well as with those of you I've never spoken with. So my main sort of thesis for the next 2.5 minutes or so is that retractions are on the rise. That is really not controversial. I'll show you some data anyway, because we should all be evidence-based, but not enough, which I suspect among this group is not all that controversial either, but I do want to at least give you some food for thought in that direction. There we go. So just to set the stage a little bit, this is a plot of the percent of retractions, in other words, the rate of retraction, this is Science and Engineering publication. The data are from NSF in terms of the background information and the context. The data for the retractions are from our database, which you can visit at retractiondatabase.org. We're actually coming close to 39,000 retractions there, compared with about a third of that, about 13,000 in PubMed, and fewer than that actually in Crossref, probably 9,000 or 10,000 at this point. So I don't think that's really sort of controversial either to say that we have the sort of leading and most comprehensive source of retractions in terms of a database. But what you see here is over the past 2 decades, the rate of retraction, I would say, has done 2 things. One is that it's remained still fairly small. So on the left there, the y-axis is the percentage of papers in a given year that are retracted. We're still below 0.1%. I guess we sort of spiked to 0.1% several years ago, which I'll talk about. But that it is increasing, and it's fairly linear growth. I want to just note that spike from 2015 to 2015 or so. This is just to get a little bit in the weeds, but this is these are papers that were retracted that had been published in that year. So in other words, this is not the number of retractions that happened that year. It's the number of papers from that year that were eventually retracted. So since there is a lag, which I will talk about very quickly on the next slide, it's clear that, I think maybe not clear, but I would fairly comfortably predict that, in fact, you're going to see that curve kind of continue to do this. Because what's happening, as I will make clear shortly, is that there's a lot more scrutiny, and by some of you, in fact, who are on this meeting today. And so, again, quite rare, but definitely increasing. The actual numbers, we didn't quite get to 5,000 last year, but in the year 2000, there were about 40 retractions. In 2022, there were about 4,600 retractions. Again, but as a rate, it didn't go up quite that dramatically, not sort of 100-fold, but as a rate, it still went up, fairly significantly. There we go. Why is this happening, right? So I think that, people often ask me, well, does that mean there's more misconduct happening? That's certainly possible, and I in no way would rule that out. But if you want to be evidence-based about it, I think you have to sort of look, the evidence is much more clear that it is because of what we refer to as sleuthing, people finding issues in the literature, people able to do that because papers are online now in ways that they weren't 20, 25 years ago, even 15 years ago. There's PubPure, which, full disclosure, I'm a volunteer member of the board of directors at the PubPure Foundation. But I mentioned that, and Elizabeth Pick, who I'm sure all of you either know personally or, of course, know of Elizabeth's work, is perhaps the most well-known sleuth, but we have a page of dozens of sleuths, of which Elizabeth, of course, is one, on Retraction Watch. That page is always growing. In fact, it should probably grow now. There are probably some people we need to add to it. That all has been really that kind of work, which is largely, if not exclusively, unpaid, has really, the post-publication work has really grown. And the other thing that has happened is that certainly in the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years, but even going back more than a decade, and I know that there's one of you on, at least one of you on this call who knows that quite well, having been involved in it, is that journals, again, in about 15 years ago now, a few journals started doing this. More are doing it. They're actually hiring people to look at all these allegations, and in fact, to look at some of the problems, look at papers and screen and find mechanisms to screen papers before they're even go into peer review, before they're published, to actually cut down on these problems. So all of that has really, allowed for, and I think, fostered this growth in retraction, which again, overall, I think is a good thing. It's just a question of how much more should that grow. And to get a little more granular in terms of trends, and maybe you could also argue this is sort of the bad news. If the growth in retractions is good news, even though publishers don't always agree with me when I say that, they may have to admit it through gritted teeth. The bad news, if you will, and the sort of before and after, is retractions take far too long. When they happen at all. This is just headlines from Retraction Watch, and just to give you a little bit of insight into some of the work we do, and I should, I guess, say, for those of you who don't know, Adam, Marcus, and I launched Retraction Watch about 12 and a half years ago in August of 2010, and have been, in fits and starts, sometimes growing, sometimes shrinking. We're in this bit of a growth phase again, which I really like, thanks to some generous donations, which we can always use more of. I'm a volunteer, but one of the things we started doing some years ago is filing public records requests for correspondence between universities and sometimes individual, corresponding authors and journals, where we could, in terms of public universities, to see whether or not, see how long these things were taking. What we often found out was that, contrary to what journals would like you to think, is that they act so quickly, they would sit on things. And this is, by the way, official requests. This is not, a whistleblower making an allegation that needs to be investigated. These allegations have been investigated. Authors are asking for retractions. Universities are asking for retractions. And yet, years later, nothing's happening. That's when things actually do get retracted. You probably can't read that, I apologize, but it's a paper from MBio from 2016 that Elizabeth Dick, who I mentioned, and two others published. And the punchline here is that 2% of papers that Elizabeth looked at, and that was about 20,000 different papers, had images that exhibited features suggested of deliberate manipulation. That actually reaches, that meets COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, requirements for, criteria, I should say, for retraction, and yet the vast majority of them are not retracted, in fact, and Elizabeth's kept track of all those, and that's true for, if you talk to lots of people who do that kind of work, routinely, in fact, universally, most of what they have pointed out, and these are people with excellent track records, publishers haven't done anything. And finally, the even further downstream problem, even if a paper is retracted, is that, again, consistently, and this is a paper that Alison Abritis, who's our full-time researcher at Retraction Watch and runs our database, co-authored with a few other librarian and library researchers. People find that more than 90% of the time, papers continue to be cited as if they hadn't been retracted. This is in the biomedical literature, and that's where a lot of this tends to focus, for better or for worse. But the point is that why would you want to cite a retracted paper in support of your idea? I don't know. I mean, maybe you have a reason for that. I'd love to know what it is. But if you were to, for example, do that in a court case, certainly here in the US, where I know the system a little bit, you would nothing good would happen. You would lose the case. You probably would be sanctioned if the judge knew that you were citing not a scientific paper so much, but a precedent that had been overturned, for example. There's something called shepherdization that's supposed to prevent that. And people can use our database and use Zotero or EndNote or papers or some other software and methods that actually ingest our database, and we're very excited and thrilled about that, to try and cut down on those citations. But so far, that doesn't seem to be doing all that much, frankly. I think we still have to let it all be ingested and see what happens. So I'm going to stop there. I really, again, lightning round, kind of just wanted to share with you a couple of data points, thoughts, maybe conclusions, and with that, I just want to really have a conversation, and looking forward to that.
Brilliant, Ivan. Thank you so much for the introduction. And please turn on your cameras, especially if you're asking the question. Raise your hand so I can see you, because we have a large audience. You don't all fit on one page. So as soon as you turn your camera on, you come up on the screen I can see. And if you have a question from LinkedIn audience, please put it on chat and type it in and we'll see it. So first question is in chat from Caroline. Why do you think Cochrane reviews, which are extremely influential and sell themselves as being kept up to date, are hardly ever, as far as I can tell, retracted, even when they are a decade or more out of date and are never going to be updated? I would call this misconduct, as it potentially harms patients if the reviews are used to inform decision-making.
It's a great question. I think I have to push back on the premise a little bit, though, and I'm not here to defend Cochrane by any stretch. If anyone's here from Cochrane and wants to respond, of course, they're welcome to. I think that, in fact, if you look at our database, the Cochrane is a pretty regular contributor to the database in the sense that I was actually going through some country-specific data recently for a different purpose here, and realized that, in fact, the most retractions from that particular country, which does have a Cochrane Center, were from Cochrane, and they're different. Those are not for fraud or misconduct. They're withdrawn, and sometimes they're withdrawn while they're being reviewed, updated. Sometimes they're never updated, which is probably the bigger problem. And so they use withdrawn in a slightly different way than sort of a lot of other publishers would. There, of course, that's a collaboration with Wiley. I'm aware of, and I think Caroline, you certainly are as well, of cases that really should be updated, or maybe withdrawn or retracted. So that certainly doesn't, I don't dispute that at all. But I don't think it's a overall, sort of reluctance to retract as much as a typical sort of reluctance to retract maybe certain kinds of reviews and things, and just the process not working the way we all want it to.
Thank you, Ivan. Just a request to the audience, if at all you can turn on your mic and actually ask the question instead of typing it in, that would save me reading your question. So if you do have access to the microphone, please ask. Another question from Till in the chat as well. If a journal takes 3 years to retract a paper, what is the work from within the journal? What desks do a request move across, and who is involved in that decision? And it is hard to understand how a decision can take that long.
Sure, that's a great question. And the first thing I should say is that there is no system. There are guidelines, there are best practices, which are followed sometimes. Other times they're pointed to, but not actually followed. People claim they're following it. That's all. This is the way life is. It's sort of, and I don't know how many of you, I see at least a few faces that I know are based in the US, but it's sort of like when my students say, oh, tell us about the healthcare system in the US. And I just sort of, I just I don't throw up my hands. I speak with them, they're students. But we don't have a healthcare system here. We have a mess of a, whatever, crisis. So there are rules and regulations, and not regulations, there are rules and guidelines, but again, they're not always followed. It really depends on the journal. That's not a great answer, but let me give you a couple of high-level flows, sort of workflows. If you're talking about a journal at a major publisher, and so that's Elsevier, it's Springer Nature, it's Taylor and Francis, it's I could go on. There is almost certainly a committee of some kind that probably has some lawyers on it, and may in fact involve mostly lawyers, who are going to in some way be involved in that process, adjudicate it, hopefully with the input of actual subject matter experts, not always. That is and to be a little bit maybe not naive as much as Pollyannish, sometimes those are where things actually move more quickly. When you see these 3 years, and we even saw 6 years, it's when there is literally no one paying any attention, or they just forgot or ignored it. There was one case, in Holden Thorpe, we've had frank conversations about this, but he's the editor-in-chief of science, and he's the relatively new, actually, editor-in-chief of science, and some things happened before him, to be, before his watch, to be honest. But we had a case where we put in a public records request, and we know the editor got it because we had a response from the editor saying, okay, got this, I'll take a look. And then nothing happened for 3 years. So there is no sort of like, okay, if I just speak to this person, it's not like there's a customer service desk and if it needs to get escalated, I mean, there sort of is, but there's nothing that's written down. And I mean, if I'm being cynical, I think that that's probably intentional. But I also want to just point out, let me get back to the lawyers for a second before I finish answering. Lawyers are hugely involved in all these processes in ways that almost universally slow things down. And so, for example, in Nature in 2014, even, which is years ago now, published an editorial pointing out that one of the reasons why, and they'd been criticized, as everyone had, even then, for how slow these things went, and also how mealy-mouthed the retraction notices were, right? So lawyers will water them down and make things move much more slowly because everyone's afraid of being sued. And the other thing, by the way, is that they're sort of, I would call them defense lawyers, although they're not exactly defending against anything. They're defending, reputations. A lot of people accused of misconduct or even accused of errors will lawyer up, as we say here in the States, and you end up with, again, protracted and really mealy-mouthed retraction processes that don't really tend to end the way you would hope if you were just purely interested in the scientific record and frankly in truth and justice and facts.
Thank you, Ivan. So we have another message in chat from Miranda McIntyre, and after that I'll take a question from Yana and then from David on screen. So a question from Miranda: what do you foresee about the impact of AI technologies on scientific publishing? It could be both a tool for good in detecting problematic work or exacerbate the paper mill issue.
Sure. I've been having some, I don't do this a lot, but I actually put out a tweet, I think it was last week, where I said, I'm glad there's all this. I didn't say it this way. I said it in a, frankly, somewhat maybe petulant way. I see all the attention being paid to ChatGPT. I get it, and I'm actually just as concerned. My concern, though, is that a lot publishers and a lot of editors, and there's basically, we stopped including them in our roundups because there were so many of them. There's a new, this is what we think about ChatGPT from an journal editor every day, week. It's a distraction. I think that it's an important distraction, and it's something that hopefully maybe will make people pay more attention. But the problem I have, and it's the same problem I have with publishers who are suddenly getting, you'll forgive the term, but getting religion about paper mills, which we've known about for a long time, is that it is a distraction for what is the central issue. In other words, what are the fundamentals? Yes, it's going to create problems. It's going to industrialize even further the work of industrialized paper mills. It's going to make all of that easier for people who want to cheat. One hopes that in the arms race that we've been in for decades now in terms of scientific publishing, that the detection tools and all of that will keep up. But it ignores, right, the distraction of ChatGPT, the distraction, frankly, of the over focus on paper mills at the exclusion of other issues in scientific publishing, is that it allows everyone to conveniently not discuss the real problem, which is publish or perish, and which is the sort of completely relentless reliance on metrics, and the reliance on papers in particular as a metric. And so if you don't do anything about that, yes, you can go catch the horse, the GPT being the horse here, after the horse has left the barn, but there's something else in the barn, and it's probably worse than the horse, and it's going to come along. We need to actually figure out the barn, right? And I don't even know what that metaphor means, but I will say that we have to think very carefully about what is making all of this worthwhile for cheaters, as opposed to, and not as opposed to, but in addition to looking at the individual behavior, which is, again, what a lot of what we do at Retraction Watch. So I think it's going to have a big effect. It already is. But I think I would hate for it to be a distraction.
Thank you. David, your question.
Yes, I've been going around saying mainly on Twitter or on Mastodon, where I now try to stay most of the time, that ChatGPT is a major failure. And I do wish people would stop being entranced by it. Frank Harrell did a good post, a great statistician from Duke, I think. And the thing gave wrong answers in the first place, and he told it was wrong, and it modified it. And in the end, it got quite a good answer, but the intelligence that went into it was Harrell's, not the bot. And I've done exactly the same thing. People should just stop being entranced by these toys, I think. But my experience with bad papers is mainly been in the alternative medicine field. And I recall I did actually get invited, to their credit, I suppose, to talk to the editors of BMC Chinese Medicine, which publishes a lot of nonsense, for all politically correct, according to the Chinese government, no doubt. And they just wouldn't admit that many of these papers were lousy, probably some of them fraudulent. They didn't behave like scientists at all. They simply denied everything. So it's great. I think the work that Retraction Watch does is great. It's drawn attention to these things, but they're very far from solved, I'm afraid.
I would agree with well, both of your sort of themes and comments, Sarah. I appreciate the praise and would completely agree that we're not in a position to solve any real problems. We're in a position, hopefully, to bring attention to some percentage of them, but not even a high one. I'm reminded when you were talking about Frank and just sorry, I'm sure you'll take this in the spirit it's intended, just to correct. He's at Vanderbilt rather than Duke, but
thank you.
Duke has well, Duke certainly looms large in Retraction Watch for various other reasons. But I was reminded, as you were saying, in fact, the intelligence is, of course, ours, meaning in that case, Frank's, and Frank has lots of intelligence. There was a famous, you can all look it up, I won't take the time, but there's a famous scene from Seinfeld here in the US, when it was still on, about the phone used to be able to call 777 film, and it somehow ended up at Kramer's. He was one of the characters, of course, Kramer's, that it was somehow, crossed phone lines. He would pick up the phone and it would be somebody looking for a movie, but he could never figure out what the dial tone, the sort of numbers, whatever was pressing. So he'd say, why don't you just, in that sort of robot voice, why don't you just tell me the movie you'd like to see? And it's sort of like, Frank, why don't you just tell me what you want me to spit out? And well, of course. Anyway, sorry, let's other question.
Thank you. We have another comment in the chat from Francesco Kappa. So given that the sooner the better for retraction, should it also be considered the gravity of the reason for retraction? A retraction may occur for several reasons, which may go from an error from the authors to minor issues like copyright issues for some pictures, as per the reasons reported in the Retraction Watch, to misconduct. Should it be useful to also report the gravity of what has occurred?
Absolutely. One of the reasons that Adam and I launched Retraction Watch was that, in addition to the journalistic reason, which is, maybe less important to this audience, but when you find a source of stories, particularly about bad human behavior that is hiding in plain sight, that's pretty amazing that's wonderful. It's for journalists. Obviously, we want to push further than what's just available publicly. But the other reason we noted was that retraction notices were awful. They were the opposite of transparent. There was a particular Journal of Biological Chemistry, that used to publish actually a fair number of retractions, and then they went up and published even more once they got better. But they used to have one-line retraction notices. This was withdrawn by the author. That tells you absolutely nothing. It doesn't tell you if the author realized that they made a mistake, and so they want to withdraw the paper, which we should honor and celebrate. Or the author was told by his or her university, if you don't do that, or it's a condition of your employment, or it's a condition of your sanction because you've committed misconduct. So we have been for 12 and a half years screaming from every rooftop that everybody will have us on, please, include better retraction notices. So, and in fact, when you look at COPE guidelines, which again are, I would argue, sort of intentionally misinterpreted in many cases, it says very clearly the reason for retraction should be included. This journal, JBC, actually at one time said, well, that's the reason it was withdrawn by the authors. And I said, that's a weird tautological circular, argument that I don't really have a lot of time for. They changed it after we beat them up for 5 years. I don't mean a violence metaphor, after we wrote about them critically for 5 years. So in fact, that should be included. And I'll sort of go further than that and say that it is actually critically important, not just for the scientific enterprise, but for individual scientists who are involved. So there are great data, there are a number of interesting papers that have come to essentially the same conclusion, and they're done usually by economists who really like to look at retraction notices and retraction data, because it is that sort of mix, that intersection that economists love of sort of fairly small and circumscribed data set, fairly binary, something's retracted or not, and it involves human behavior, often bad human behavior, and it involves incentives, right? And so they like to look at these data, and what they've universally found is that when retraction notices have the reason for retraction, and it is fraud or misconduct, something on the bad side of things, which is about 2/3 of retractions, I should note. Entire fields, not just that author or that group, sees a decline in their citations. So even unconsciously or consciously, scientists are seeing that. But better news, and in fact, I think the more important message of those studies is that the opposite is also true. The converse is also true. When retractions happen, and they happen with clear notices and says, this is what happened, there was an honest error. In other words, we had the wrong reagent, we made that calculation error, something where they very explicitly explain what happened and it was not fraud. Those researchers and those fields actually don't see a decline in citations. Even one paper, which hasn't been replicated, to be fair, but that found that they see an increase. So in other words, honesty is being rewarded. I wouldn't go that far because it's just one paper, but at the very least, the important thing is that they don't seem to see a decline. So there are lots of really good reasons to do this, other even than the obvious transparency reasons, which I think we should all welcome. I mean, there are, for example, I'll say one more thing about this, and I want to get to the other question, of course, but one of the papers, we keep a list of, on Retraction Watch, of the top 10 cited retracted papers, right? And they move around a little bit, but there are some papers you'll all recognize that are always in the top few. And one of them is about a molecule called visfatin. I won't go into the details of that. You're welcome to look it up. But essentially, there were a couple different groups, one of which did commit misconduct, the other of which didn't commit misconduct. And you can actually trust those data. But the reason the paper was retracted because there's misconduct by one particular group. And that paper continues to be cited, and that's probably not an awful thing as long as you cite it and explain that you're citing sort of this piece of it in support of what you're doing, which again argues for transparency and fulsome, as we like to say, retraction notices.
Thank you, Ivan. Lydia, please go ahead with your question.
Hi, so Ivan, we had some contact like more than 10 years ago, and I don't know if
oh, yes, Lydia, yeah, of course, yes, thank you. Yeah.
You remember the whole story of GCMAP, Dr. Yamamoto, and the Einstein Institute in Philadelphia. Yeah. So, but what I would like to bring in here in the conversation is a totally different driver than the published or perish reason for coming up with that type of paper. Really intentional fraud, I would call it, is just business and money. And maybe that's very typical for the oncology field. I flagged it 2 weeks ago, Lisa, if you remember, but we see that happening more and more. And for us who want to properly inform patients and come with evidence-based information to patients, we are getting really worried about this trend in oncology, and certainly with cell therapy and personalized vaccines, I'm afraid we're going to see a tsunami coming on that type of things that are really based, well, in a lot of cases on scientific papers in predatory journals. And then it's a real business model that is coming up nowadays and has nothing to do with scientists wanting to have their paper published and needing those publications. It's a totally different angle. And I would be happy to hear Ivan's idea on how to fight that. We have been fighting that in the past intensively, but yeah, we kind of gave up because, like the GCMAF story, I realized that recently it's still, you can still buy it over the internet. The old papers, as you said, Ivan, are still cited on those websites, even though we had them, some of them were retracted. So yeah. We're getting a little desperate on that, honestly. So happy to hear your ideas on that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Lydia, for saying hello and reminding me of that important and awful story. I think I certainly wouldn't disagree with you. I very much agree with you that purely commercial sort of concerns are part of this. I guess, and this is honestly just semantics, I would include that in publisher Paris, because to me, publisher Paris includes the fact that, you know, for example, the FDA would require, you know, studies done a certain way that would be of publication quality. I mean, you can sort of relate all of that to the coin of the realm in some way. And I mean that obviously commercial, financial way, being a paper. But I don't, again, I certainly don't disagree. This is critical. I guess what I would say is that it points to something we have all known for a long time. I don't know if we've all known it, but a lot of us have known for a long time. And again, I see some folks on this Zoom that were involved in some of these early cases. Remember that, you know, reprints of journal articles, particularly big clinical trials that, you know, claim to show X drug worked, et cetera. Those were a fundamental part and arguably the fundamental part of journals' business models for so many years. Richard Smith, who many of you may know, has of course written about this long before we were ever doing anything, when he was editor of BMJ and shortly thereafter. So these reprints would, and we've learned this, you know, millions of dollars. There's electronic versions of them now, but this was literally printing it out and making sure drug reps put it in the hands of physicians, of people who could prescribe. So I guess what I'm saying is, to me, it's all related. In other words, the entire model, whether it's in terms of publisher Paris in order to keep your role, you know, get promoted, tenure, et cetera, or, you know, to make a point and sell something, whether you're a big pharma company or a sort of dodgy, you know, company selling a particular compound that you're making claims about. I very much agree with you. It's an issue, and I just would see it as part of the, again, the sort of the over, how do I say, it's, and we've only seen this in the pandemic as well, of course, but the extreme over reliance on what is not essentially, but what is a deeply flawed peer-reviewed process as some sort of arbiter of truth, when we all know that while peer review is actually, when done well and when you know what's happened and can see an audit trail, if you will, of it, adds value, often is just a tick box ticking exercise. And that's again part of the issue to me.
Thank you, Ivan. So we have a question from Dan and then Francesco. Then,
right, yeah. I've discussed with colleagues whether PubMed would be able to flag articles that have an expression of concern or ongoing investigation. And during that period, the journals would not allow those articles to be cited. And then could one take this one step further? Would PubMed and EndNote and other reference handlers be in a position to announce that authors have requested retraction and thereby bypass the journal if it doesn't act fast enough? Would that be possible?
It's certainly possible. And again, if someone is here from National Library of Medicine or any of those organizations, they should. I can't speak for any of them what they can and can't do. I think sometimes we, and this is not to say we shouldn't do this, but I think what often tends to happen is we focus on what's public and the sort of people who are actually trying to do something because they're doing it in an open way, like PubMed, like, and frankly, EndNote and all of those, and Zotero. But when really we should focus on making sure the system's better. I don't mean those are mutually exclusive, but I think that's just a natural tendency. It's frankly why we look at retractions and publishers. I mean, we're not guilty, but we do the same thing for obvious reasons. I think that there's a couple things I would say. First of all, the technology exists. It has existed for years, more than a decade. In 2011, right, in the sort of infancy of Retraction Watch, we were invited to write a comment piece for Nature, which we did, and I can send it around if you're interested. But the title is, I believe the paper is not sacred, right? And so what we were, we were making a number of arguments, good, bad, and otherwise, and in fact, our thinking has changed, not so much in the central idea, but, as data has changed and we've learned more, has changed. But one of the fundamental arguments we were making in that piece was that the technology is there, and at the time it was called Crossmark. Now it's called, I think, Check for Updates. But if publishers, and again, unfortunately, it relies on publishers to do this. If publishers were to install this, what's called, Crossmark, Check for Updates, you would actually see everything that was involved, and you might add alt metrics, you might add blogs and tweets and conversations happening about that, need to be filtered in some way. If there was a PubPure comment, I've mentioned PubPure a couple times, that would be linked, and that's already linked in some alt metrics, not in every website's alt metrics. So that all exists. I don't necessarily think we could sort of hope that PubMed or any of the sort of official indexers can do it, and that may be more about statutes and what people are comfortable with than anything important. But the point is, more centrally, Dan, I think that the technology exists. We are trying to be part of some of that software, obviously, as people ingest the database. But again, we're the end stage, right? Retractions are the end stage. Knowing when someone has raised an allegation, would be even more important, and knowing there's an investigation happening. Publishers, though, have actually taken steps away from that, taken steps further from that. So, for example, PubMed, you mentioned, they do flag expressions of concern when the metadata are sent to publishers. When publishers send the metadata to PubMed, and same thing for EndNote and others. What publishers have started doing is doing things that are actually expressions of concern, but that don't involve any new metadata. Apologies to anyone if I'm getting into some weird, weedy territory, but we all are scientifically inclined, if not scientists. And I think sometimes you have to look at like how the sausage is made. I say that as a vegetarian. If the publishers are turning what we all would consider an expression of concern into this little sort of anchor link and editor's note at the bottom of the abstract, which is there, to be fair, on the paper when you look at the abstract, but is not new metadata that gets transmitted to the indices. That is a step backward. It's a step backward we've told the publishers we think is a bad idea. Sometimes they listen to us, most of the time they don't. And so again, like so much of this, all roads lead to Rome, so much of the metadata flow and ends up coming from, to, through the publishers. We unfortunately need to somehow either divorce it from that, which would be awesome, but somewhat long range, I think, or somehow figure out another system.
Thank you. Francesco, please go ahead.
Hi, good evening. Do you hear me?
I do.
Sorry, I do not have the camera. So thanks for your reply to my first question. And I was first of all asking in the chat, so I report also now whether there is a paper, a publication that explains, that supports what you said before. That was very interesting to me. So that when a retraction happens as a result misconduct. There is a decline in citations when instead the retraction is for good. Let's say there is no decline in citation. Is there a publication or some reference that I can find?
Sure. I didn't bring them today, and I apologize for that, but I can share it. However, I mean, I guess I could look right now and find them, but and they're easy enough to find. There's one paper. I don't remember if it was ever in a journal. I think it was eventually in a journal, yes, but it was, I think, an NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research paper. The title is something like the retraction penalty. That was one reference. There are Azoulay. I don't remember if he's on that paper. I think it was Pierre, Azoulay is the, I think, leader of one of the groups that does that work, and you can sort of, he's written he's co-authored some of those papers. Ben Jones. Azoulay, I think, is still at MIT. Ben Jones is, I think, still at Northwestern. There's some, I'm being US centric because of the ones I'm remembering. I apologize, but I know there are others as well. So those are a couple of things to look for anyway. And if it's of interest, please, Ivan at retractionwatch.com will always find me. I'm happy to share that.
Thank you. And sorry, another question. Where do you think might be a good outlet where to publish research on retraction, on misconducts? Because I am conducting some research. Indeed, I have asked you a couple of years ago the database, and so you sent me. So we already have been in touch in the past, and I'm finalizing the paper, and I was thinking with my co-authors to send this research about statistics on retraction throughout sectors, and we were thinking of scientometrics, but I would like also to ask you where you think it's a good outlet, or whether there are some special issues open where one can submit studies about retractions.
Sure, I'll answer generally, and I apologize. I'm happy to follow up, of course. But I would say, so one thing to do, you could look at, we actually have a page on our site of papers that have cited our work one way or another, either the database or just something we've written or what have you. It probably would give you a decent sense, and there's well over 100 papers there now in the bibliography. I think, in fact, we need to add some more. It might just give you a sense of the sorts of places that are interested in this work. I guess my feeling on scientometrics is nothing against the journal. One thing I will note is that they've gone through there was a sort of, let's call it an unfortunate episode that's worth looking up. In terms of control of the journal, and in terms of something that happened involving one of the papers there. We wrote about it, others did as well.
Yes, I've seen that. Yeah. A recent paper that is about predatory journal.
Yeah. I think the other thing I would say, though, just more generally, nothing to do with scientometrics, more to do with field-specific journals like that, is you probably have peer reviewers who actually hopefully understand what you're looking at, which is the good news. The bad news is you're not necessarily going to get broad reach. So when we've published, very occasionally, usually because someone invites us to, we actually publish in science sort of field-specific journals that aren't scientometrics or bibliometrics, that they're, anesthesiology or, maybe larger journals. When we want to do things, we obviously publish on Retraction Watch, but when we want to do something in a scientific literature, we think it's more important to get in front of the people who are actually doing the work that's affected, as opposed to people studying the work that's affected, if that makes sense.
But if we want to make a picture of, across sector, sorry, and this is the last question, sorry for these multiple questions, but if you want to make a study that is across sectors, so not on management, not on technology, not on medicine, but across disciplines, what do you suggest to consider?
I would look, Francesco, at the list of bibliography, because we've, PLOS One publishes papers like that too. So. Okay,
thank you very much.
I have a question for you from I bird view perspective. So imagine students somewhere faraway places of the globe, or even probably we don't need to go too far. Probably at any university, we have a very knowledgeable audience who works in the subject, and we think it's obvious that bad research needs to be retracted, but vast majority of people might not even know that something's wrong with science, something gets retracted. And this perception that if this is published, especially with a particular brand of a journal, by design, it's true. Fake news cannot get there, or bad stuff cannot get there. It's not even questioned for them to say, oh, if you're reading it, why don't you check if it's been retracted? Why don't you check if it's a good research? Why don't you check if... I suspect most people actually involved in systematic reviews as their job don't have a task or a checkbox on a daily basis to check every single article for whether it's been raised for retraction, so to speak. How do we get it to the masses in that sense? Because I dream kind of a system where in something like PubMed, things come up with red flag or something, hey, pay attention, learn about this. So how do we get to the public to even let people know that there's a little bit bigger to dig there?
Well, I think you have to get into the first of all, I think you have to actually just start in terms of not having, not feeding into intentionally or unintentionally or consciously or unconsciously this sort of, in the US, we used to have this sort of good housekeeping seal of approval, this notion that if it's peer reviewed, it's true. Let's actually all think, not so much this group, which I think has, would agree with that in some way, that's not the case, I should say. But actually sort of think about that, because again, that gets us into the problems we've had, some of the problems we've had in the pandemic. It gets, the notion that, science is somehow, sorry, if I don't move much, my office light goes off. There we go. So I think there's just a sort of fundamental issue there that we should sort of be more honest about peer review and with education and what have you. So that's number one. Number two, scare them. Like if that fails, or just in conjunction with it, so many of you, I imagine, in fact, a number of you on this call had the same experience that so many of the people that we talked to have had, which is you actually believed all that. You wanted to believe in good intentions. You wanted to believe in science correcting itself, all of that. And then something happened that completely destroyed. And that's related to the fact that that's what you were taught, and sort of that was the socialization you had. And then it just destroys your view of all that. And many of you have worked your way through it the way I've tried to do, and say, oh, well, wait, okay, it means that it is correcting, but really not as well or as quickly as we want, work through all that. But then there's just sort of the software and tools problem, right? And so if you're really talking, I mean, the public is something else. I feel like there's actually two publics that you're talking about. The public is sort of, okay, let's talk about why when someone, changes their mind or comes to a different conclusion, that actually means science is working. It's not the opposite. It's not flip-flopping the way it's been partisanized. Or it's just not partisan necessarily. Sometimes it is. But in terms of the public that is looking, actually the people who are about to cite papers or do more research into an area or learn something or try and learn something in terms of science, we need to get the right information into tools. Now, I'm biased in the sense that I would like everyone to use the Retraction Watch database, but I'm also very, upfront about that's only a small part of, and to Dan's question earlier about what kinds of information we need to get in front of people. So PubMed does do this, right? And EndNote does do this. They all do this, but they need the metadata from the publishers. And the publishers do not have much of an interest, it appears, in providing that metadata. There's a NISO, that's a National Institute of Science, of Standards Organizations here in the States, that I'm part of a subcommittee sort of thing, looking at retractions and best practices. Like, I think we're going to actually say what to me are fairly obvious things, but if it means that more people pay attention because it's NISO and not like Ivan Oransky ranting and raving on a Zoom or on Twitter, like, all the better. So we need to just, like, the material is there. Maybe it's certainly not perfect, but it is certainly much better than it would appear. We need to actually get the information to the software and to the tools and all of that.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left. So a question from Francesco, then Liddy, and then Yana.
I think Francesco may just still have his hand up.
No, sorry. Yeah, it's my fault. Yeah, sorry.
All right, Liddy, go ahead, please.
Yes, I try to be brief. I was just wondering, coming back to your question, Lisa, if we're talking about fraudulent retractions, could you think of any collaboration with Quackwatch from FDA? Is there, or is that, sorry for my ignorance, I'm not familiar with the US system, but is that something you have been thinking of to make it more generally known if it's really crackery? That Quackwatch system, I don't know how good it works.
Quackwatch is, just to be, Quackwatch is not a system, right? It's Stephen Barrett and some colleagues have been doing a tremendous job for many years, but they're much like us. They have no official standing or authority. I would like to think they've been very successful, and they're an important. In fact, we've written about at least one case that I can think off the top of my head where Stephen Barrett's efforts led to 20 different retractions by a particular researcher. We'd be happy to collaborate. I don't know that that's really a direct line, frankly, to the larger American public or the international public. We both have our audiences. Maybe we could boost it a bit. We actually collaborate more with other news organizations that have a much bigger reach than we do. So we publish stories there. We actually just got another green light on a project we're working on, which I'm very excited about it. About a story in another part of the world. So I think that's, to me, that's Quackwatch is great. It's not necessarily sort of going to get us, and vice versa. That working with us is not going to get them further either.
Yeah, I'm really thinking of system to reach patients, which is our major concern, of course. But okay, yeah, thank you for explaining.
Thank you, Lady. As you see, there's a lot of thinking to do in the area where, in addition to the groundwork that's being done, there is massive outreach need for educating different publics. Jana, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So, I just wanted to mention paper mill products and mass retractions. So, can you just talk about that briefly? What do you think are the bottlenecks for those mass retractions, and do you see many journals going over their published record and trying to clean up? And do you see a difference between journals that are with big publishing companies and those that sort of publish themselves, like the Institute of Physics or Royal Society of Chemistry?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Jana. And I think there's a couple things I would say. Again, publishers have actually started to do these mass retractions hundreds at a time, 800 at a time, I think once, in fact. And that's a good thing. And I think the large publishers are sort of getting to it. They're still getting to it very slowly. Again, some of you on this Zoom are very well aware of that because you've brought these issues to their attention and sort of had silence or prolonged silence. I don't know how to say this other than it depends entirely on, what someone, whether or not that particular, whether it's a nonprofit publisher or for-profit publisher, or society, big, large, big, small, whether they actually have the will and have made the effort and sort of have put in the resources. As you well know from doing that kind of work yourself. And so again, IOP is one of the most active now. Institute of Physics is one of the most active now because they've taken this on board and they've hired some people. IEEE is sort of getting there. Give them some points for moving on some things. Springer Nature and a lot of the major publishers have kind of started to talk with one voice in ways that I find a little bit not so good because it's clear that they're sharing talking points about how they're victims of paper mills, and so therefore they're taking it seriously, and they're going to do all these retractions and everything else. I find it a bit like the scene in Casablanca. I'm shocked. There's gambling going on here. You're winning, sir. Right. So, and they've heard me say that they don't like it, and that's fine. I think it really depends almost entirely. It's not sort of, the trend isn't necessarily big, small. Otherwise, I think the trend is just very, is there someone there or a group of people there that is actually taking this seriously? I will say that it is certainly boosting the numbers of retractions in our database. And Allison, a brightest who I mentioned earlier, is even busier and has a small army of help now. Thankfully, we have some funding for that. But yeah, it's just I guess my last comment on that would be, again, the same way with ChatGPT, and as I mentioned, even with paper mills, I wouldn't want it to distract too much from the core issue. In other words, what publishers aren't saying is, yeah, you're right, there's some problem with special issues, which is where these paper mills seem to really have, that's a vulnerable position. And instead of saying, well, wait, let us rethink these special issues, and on the mass scale that so many publishers do, which are huge moneymakers for them, whether they're subscription or not, by the way. It's also not just the open access model here, it's subscription as well, because they can sell bigger bundles to libraries, etc. They don't look at first principles and sort of, because they created that problem and they're happy to continue printing money that way. So as much attention as we should pay to paper mills, let's not lose let's not lose sight of the other fundamental issues.